Thank you to everyone who came back from lunch. As we know that folks are going to trickle in. What we're going to be doing this afternoon is diving into some of the questions that we identified this morning. And we'll spend a moment sort of trying to walk through them. And then the other thing we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the process. And we're going to dive in deep of not just scheduling, but how we see this going. And some folks sort of framed this before the meeting, before the lunch break of saying, well, let's really have a punctuation of phase one with the minimum viable, set things up for more ambitious stuff down the road, but really say, hey, listen, we're here, we've done this work, this needs to get out there, so let's figure out how we can make this get out there today. So, we have 4 questions, and I want to thank Megan Dosher, who is my colleague at NTIA, who handles a lot of our national security, cybersecurity work. She's been doing this for a while, and also is the person who makes a lot of these meetings continue to run while I'm up here jabbering. So thank you. So we've got 4 things here that I think would be useful to talk about, although I'm going to shift the order. We're going to start with opacity and namespace, and then we're going to tackle transparency and tooling. So I'm going to sort of try to frame these and see if there's any feedback on how we're thinking about these problems. The idea of opacity is we want to make sure that we have the unknowns are known. So if we think of our tree, our dependency tree, can we be explicit about the difference between a leaf, this isn't using any new code, versus this is potentially the top of a dark branch and we don't know anything about it? I feel that that data is going to be very useful to have as part of this discussion. So that's the opacity question. Or opaqueness, we can talk about that. Namespace is the complement to the challenge of uniqueness, right? We worried, hey, are we sure that this software is this software? So uniqueness is making sure that only one thing has a name, but the problem is we've got overload rather than collision. So we have too many names for a single feature. And so there are some things out there. I don't think we're going to solve it completely, but I think there's some things that we can build into our documents and our thinking now so that it's not quite as big a problem as we all think it is, because this is often something that is flagged when I talk to people about this. Transparency is something that Art talked about. This is how we, NTIA, framed this initiative to start with, of being transparent around the software components, but what does the act of transparency looks like? And how do we share it? And I think we can talk about whether it makes sense to draw a distinction between sharing data further up in the build chain or in the supply chain versus that final piece of transparency of getting the data into the hands of the owner-operators, a term we heard earlier, the person who is going to be using it for a slightly different set of uses. And then finally, something that has come up across the board is tooling. From the beginning, almost all of you have emphasized this has to be automated. This isn't something we're going to do by hand. And so looking into sketching out when we say tooling, what do we mean? And let's really do a mapping of that space, figuring out what we can do today and where do we need to spend a lot more time and attention on work. So we're going to now have a few minutes of agenda whacking. Is there another question that you guys desperately want to have on this agenda?
How do you define success on if we did everything we wanted on one of those topics, what would we come out of this with?
It's a great question, because I think some of these, there will not be a concrete solution. What I'd like us to do is make sure that we can make some progress and hopefully find things that, for our deliverables, we can now dig our teeth into.
Can I suggest that we identify the group that's responsible for getting to conclusion on that point?
That's a great idea. Thank you. We will again, for groups, there's always a little bit of a challenge, but I think having a point on it is going to be very useful. Josh.
Before the break, we talked about, can we carve off a phase one?
Yes. So after we have this discussion on the substance, then we're going to take a step back and talk a little bit about what the phasing looks like. None of that is to say that that's not an idea that we should bring into this discussion of saying, hey, by the way, this is an important topic, we should address it, but that is a more complex than what we'll be able to solve over the next few months. So I want you to please keep that idea in mind. Is that fair? We are definitely going to be talking about the importance of phase one. And then finally, just for those who are watching the webcast, this is where we really want your voice and your input. And again, I mentioned that we have a challenge, which is there's a little bit of a delay. So it may be in your interest this is now where you can get on the phone line, and you'll be able to raise your hand for those who are already on the phone line. Thank you. You hit *1 to get in my queue, and then we can bring your insight into the discussion. If you're following on the webcast, it's just going to be a little bit further behind, so it's hard to do both at once. We apologize for that. Thank you for your flexibility and for all the time you're given to this. All right. So we have this challenge of the known unknowns. And to put Art on the spot just a little bit, can you give us some idea about how your group has thought about this so far?
Let me take a crack at that. I'm going to start by just trying to more or less restate my version of what you just said. So I'm a supplier, and I create SBOMs for the things that my developers type with their fingers on their keyboards. Straightforward, right? The things we include, want to hop up the supply chain, I grab SBOMs when they're provided to me. That works. When there is not an SBOM provided, but I know that I'm using component X, I can say I use component X, and I might be making up the ID, not that supplier. But then the question becomes, do I think there are more things in component X? Did I run SCA tools on them? Do I know because I know this field very well? Right? Do I know or have confidence there are more things in there? Or do I know nothing, or I'm unwilling to make a claim further back than that? So as far as I've thought about it, some sort of a mechanism, it might just be a field or a way to say, I've got some variable level of confidence in what I'm about to say, but I'm pretty sure this is in here. I'm slightly sure this is in here. I have no knowledge. We want to capture that assertion somehow, and/or the confidence in it. Hopefully, there's a technique to do that. Someone already knows, but that's what I think we need to do.
That's a good point. This is going beyond just the, hey, there's stuff here, but actually saying, I may know something about that stuff. So this is translucency to really twist a metaphor. Josh.
Yeah, I think originally we thought it was a huge win just to say it's a known unknown and call it opaque or blind spot. So a binary, I think in the last couple of weeks we've noticed you could have a gradient of confidence, which could be a software composition analysis tool thinks it's this version. So about a finite number of values, but to the strength of your claim or your confidence. And in a free market, people could take or leave different levels of that. And instead of making this a regulatory claim for like the FDA guy that was sitting here, I'm thinking of the banks that already spoke at these things. They could say, we'll tolerate no more than 10% blind spots, or no more than, we need a guess, a non, that could be borne out by the market demand.
Right? I do think one thing we have to get into at some point, that I don't think anybody said today, related particularly to the soup, and that is in the field of open source, when you're using the other person's source versus when you're using the other person's executable. And I think it's in the example Art used when I said I go get this thing, if the thing is the executable, then yes, an SBOM should come with it, and if an SBOM doesn't come with it, then you have to guess. And we were all in this discussion of how we're guessing whatever it is we're going to put out. But I think in the case where you get the open source and you compile it yourself, that's no longer the open source person's the supplier. You are now doing the compilation. You make the SBOM when you compile it would at least be, I would not consider that soup. I'd consider that known, at least to that level, and maybe it calls out something else and that becomes soup. But I think we're not distinguishing between the two, and sometimes, at least in all the other discussions we've had, there's been confusion. So I think we at least have to make clear what it is we're talking about being opaque.
Good point. I want to go to Dave, but I also want to make sure that we're all in agreement with the statement. If it's open source code, then it should be pretty easy to figure out all the way down to the all the turtles if everything's open.
If you compile it.
If you compile it.
So I understand the distinction that you're making, Duncan, but if you take source code for a third-party component and compile it yourself, and then you redistribute that, and another party uses that, you're not that much different actually than any other third party to that new party that is using the software. And so,
with respect to opaqueness, I disagree.
Confidence isn't necessarily transitive in those kinds of cases.
So, and this is where we're getting into some of the nuance around confidence versus lack of knowledge, and I want to keep that theme running. Bruce.
One of the things you have to think about is JavaScript, and that's a whole different model than we've been talking about here. But when you do JavaScript, it picks and chooses and all that as it's going from all over the place. You could be accessing 1,000 files just to get one function. It's, they need to build some tooling in that if we're going to do something along these lines. And it's not a question of compile or not, really.
I don't disagree. So it's a big problem. There's a lot of pieces to it. In that really fancy chart that when Art put it up there, he said it's too complicated for everyone. The reality is eventually we have to deal with that whole chart. And that's one of the cases that's beyond the green box, but does have to be handled. I don't disagree we have to handle it. But to Josh's point earlier of, hey, let's do things we can do first, at least if you're within the green box, let's do a simpler case of, hey, you're within the green box, it is in code that is executing on something you're selling, and it is code that you either wrote yourself, got from open source, or got an executable from open source. We can at least make that a fairly simple case, and then we just decide on each of these cases, what do we do?
And does everyone like that breakdown? We've got do a quick note on that. I want to let Duncan continue. I just want to make sure that we like that breakdown.
Yeah, except that there was a different suggestion, and I can't remember who made it, that I think it's SPDX lets you know that one of the linkages is, compiled from, right? So there's an explicit relationship. I compiled from that source. I'm going to share most of the same vulnerabilities as that source. Maybe not all, but most of it. I'm going to be mostly similar. And I don't think we never had that in the opaqueness category, but I can see why you're bringing it up there. But I thought we had a different way to handle derived from source.
So if we like, I want to get, actually, Dave, yeah, why don't you chime in here?
I just wanted to provide some context from a SWID tag perspective as far as how we're addressing this problem. So there's really two ways that we deal with this opacity problem. There's this notion of authoritative versus non-authoritative tags. So the idea is if the person creating the tag is the same person that had some role in either creating or distributing that software, which sort of takes into consideration what Duncan has been saying, then that's considered an authoritative tag. And then if there's a mismatch there, then if there are multiple parties that are involved in both creating the tag and distributing the software, then that's considered a non-authoritative tag. So that's the first way. The second way that we deal with this sort of opacity problem is as it relates to the manifest of the software itself. And in that case, there's two types of manifests that you can provide. The first is a payload, which is an authoritative manifest of the software. So the intent there is that the software components that are referenced in the manifest the information is being provided by the software creator. And then the other one is evidence, which is more of a forensic type of capture of information. So if you have a third-party discovery tool that is analyzing some installed software, it can produce evidence in the form of a SWID tag, a non-authoritative SWID tag that would define information about that software. And so that's how we handle opacity.
So and that seems that you hit both the known unknowns issue as well as the known questionable issues. So we've got Jim and then Art.
Yes, so going back to Art's presupposition that if I am well-behaved and if my suppliers are well-behaved, then that fills out the whole tree, right? And that only works is if everybody has a preference to obey Deming and to get well-behaved suppliers. So it seems to me that when we're talking about opacity, that we're really saying to what degree did I choose a well-behaved supplier? And if we could indicate that, then that would be one way of measuring opacity, or having gradations in it. That is, this is a supplier that provided all this information, and I know, for instance, that this is the leaf of the node, a leaf node, or this is one where the supplier provided information, but I have less confidence in it because they didn't express full confidence in themselves, or I don't know anything.
Sort of we've got three levels, which is I've got it, I don't know it, or something in the middle that could be classed.
Would you please just restate, you were checking in a minute ago, and you said something to the effect of, is everyone okay with this axiom or something? Could you just rephrase that?
I want to try to capture two of Duncan's axioms, which is one, you're either, in terms of where this code can come from, it's either open source, a binary, and there was a third option, which was...
So it's either code you created and compiled, code you got from open source and compiled, or executables you got from somewhere else. And yes, it only applies in the green box area of the original complicated chart. It doesn't apply to some of the edge cases, but at least it applies to a large amount of software.
So we have that combined with the axiom that if if you have access to the open source code and you are compiling it yourself, then generating the complete all the levels BOM is not a hard problem. And those are the two axioms that we have on the table.
And I'll be very glad if they become Duncan's axioms and become famous like Moore's Law. So.
No, it's fine.
All right, these are the Duncan's axioms. David.
So I think we should, so you just raised the point that if you're compiling source code that's provided by another party, that's not providing an SBOM is not a hard problem. I think we should answer that question after we have some of the namespace and naming kinds of conversations, because what we've found with talking to folks about implementing SWID tags is there's no substitute for actually knowing authoritative information about your own software product when it comes to things like characterizing it and naming it and that sort of thing. Building things like a manifest is more of a computational process. Anybody can do that, but not everybody can sort of understand the context of the software. And so a third party compiling software is going to know slightly less about the software that they're compiling than the first party that's actually creating it.
That's a great point. So I want to try to capture, all right, Josh?
To partially satisfy Jonathan here, based on what our Stephen was saying from GE Healthcare, one of the Deming benefits, so forget necessarily what we would do in this room, but one of the benefits of fewer and better suppliers that gets glossed over is it reduces operational variance to have less entropy in total catalog of parts. It's not so much that they were the most superior part, and this, in fact, Jim Routh did this at Aetna. They had 11 logging frameworks in use. He asked, can we standardize on 3? And they got huge developer productivity. So variance as an operational margin increaser is a good thing. It's also a good security thing. And I think a natural byproduct of the pursuit of SBOMs is going to be we're not going to just pick anything from everywhere all the time. And we might favor a compiled binary that's vetted and hashed from an authoritative source over bespoke artisanal every time. We should only customize when we need to. I think we will see a natural harmonization around fewer, better catalogs of parts. And I think there's some language we could crystallize from what you guys do.
And I think that's also going to come up in the namespace issue. So I think that, hey, look, it's all related. It's almost like we're all talking about the same problem. So I'm going to try to sort of offer a suggestion because, again, or let's phrase it as a question. If we have these two separate issues, one is, or let's try this again. The art framework. We've got known knowns, known unknowns, and then data with caveats, right? That's this middle layer where I've got it from someone else, but for whatever reason, it's not at the full-on level of just being one of a SWID tag that just says it was made by someone else, but there's some reason why I wouldn't trust it. Right? It comes from an SCA tool, or there's something sketchy there. Right? So that's the translucent case. And I think, does it make sense to say we're going to leave the translucent case aside for now as a flag for future work on it, and then, because I think we've sort of got a pretty strong notion in the room that said, hey, we should flag when we don't know something, and we should perhaps kick that over to the standards group to say, is this something that we can do today in SWID and SPDX? Reactions. I've got a thumbs up. We've got a thumbs up. I can restate that if that's helpful.
Thank you, Alan. I'm just trying to bring us back to the use case in terms of whether it is, if it's not responsive to your initial use case, then of course move it to phase 2. But if part of the initial use case includes the manufacturer just trying to figure out what it is that their upstream is using, the translucent actually has value, if you will. So I'm not going to comment on thumbs up or thumbs down. I leave it to the MDMs in the room really to answer that question. I think it would be better for you guys to speak.
I think it's okay for phase 1 to say you have known knowns, you have known unknowns, and if you have anything else, then it's translucent, right? So you may or may not have anything in that category, but it's okay to consider it in phase 1.
Okay, and so do we think that we have a way of capturing that best effort or the uncertainty if the tools that we have today?
Do those familiar with the SCA tools, do they give you a confidence word? I think this is in here. I'm pretty sure this is in here. I don't know what they say.
Mileage varies. When you're using something, for example, like a black duck, which was originally for license matching and snippets, they want fuzzy pattern matching. Some people call those false positives. I don't think so. I think it's potential violations, right? If you want precision, there's other tools like the SON type stuff, which is bad at the partial matching, but very deterministic, right? So I think there's not a standard across SCA as to confidence level that I've seen, but someone on the phone might have a different opinion.
Thank you for giving us, as always, the caveat. If you're listening on the phone and you would like to chime in, hit *1. Yes.
So I refirm, Peter Eastman, Refirm Labs. We do offer a confidence level through our API, but through our web interface that customers see is typically a binary, it either is here or not. We're making that decision for our customers.
Les, did you have a?
I thought I did.
Okay.
I do agree with Jim. I'm not sure about SCA's giving us that at the moment. So I think with the known knowns and the known unknowns, we can do that. And we can definitely give you caveats.
So perhaps to move forward, we can take the known knowns and known unknowns and give that to the standards group and say, hey, this is something that we think can be part of minimum viable. And perhaps arts group can take a first crack unless someone else wants to take a crack at thinking about how do we think about the translucency or the uncertainty side of things? Or do you think we have enough, we can go forward? Sorry, Duncan, yeah.
No, I do think you should do exactly what you said. I think we should make sure we're not over-qualifying it to just what I'll call it, the machine-readable, what an SCA can do, because at one of these previous meetings, I don't remember which one, somebody made some observations on their data and what they had and how they had a lot of suppliers that were one person, email unknown versus, a Red Hat or an Oracle or somebody big. So there is a certain aspect you have to take into account in that confidence. It is not only what the machine can read in ones and zeros, but where it came from.
Great. So I think we'll be sure to try to revisit that and capture the overall problem of, and hopefully we'll call this uncertainty, if you don't like the term translucency, so that we can sort of document, okay, what's that look like? So I want to make any last words or things that we can put in the notes on this topic so that when it is picked up by these working groups, they're empowered to move forward?
I can't remember if it was Swamp or Car Wash. Someone in this room might know this, but DHS had two different programs that were looking at common packages, and there is an opportunity here for crowd intelligence here. If someone hunts down and determines what was a low confidence and becomes a high confidence, that could be shareable for everyone's benefit, in theory.
And I think that gets strongly to our next topic discussion. The sort of the convergence is very tied to the namespace side of things. Duncan?
So just recap again, who's doing what to conclude this?
We have the standards group is going to explicitly denote the known unknown side of things. So this software is not a leaf. There's something underneath it in a way that, I'm pulling this out myself. This is not something I have to do, but for example, a tool could say, okay, there is this much, this many things that, here's the name, we don't know what's below them. And then the framing group is going to do a high-level discussion to try to unpack this translucency or uncertainty space. And potentially tee that up to something that can be more applied in the standards group down the road.
And then just a question, I guess. Would it make sense if there is information that comes out of the proof of concept that might be of value in this area? Could we at least highlight them to, hey, we're having these issues. Help us however you can.
That's a great point, and I think this has come up that the MDMs, the medical device manufacturers, part of their work is going to be capturing what are the obstacles to generating this. Jim, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, that's right. We want to identify any issues that block or prevent information from agreeing with the format that we've defined already so far.
So, and I think that's going to be one of the big value adds is even before we get to the HDO, what are we learning from the vendors? And there could also be some work that happens, as from the use case group again, as there are a number of organizations that are starting to do this. And so again, capturing those obstacles. We'll work on feeding that into the right thing as well. Okay. So, any last words on this topic? Yes.
I'd be a little more comfortable if we said that the standards group will allow for translucency, even if it's a null set at this point.
Say
right.
A little more.
That is that we can, that whatever standardized ways we come up with to define the define known knowns and known unknowns, that we also specify a way to indicate that it's neither, and that it's up to us then, or the framing group, to define what would fit into that category.
From the formats and standards, I don't think that's going to be a problem because at least with SWID, it's very flexible and extensible. for how much people want to provide or not provide. With SWID, because it's a supplier attestation, assumably, whatever goes in there is the supplier attestation.
Right. I'm just assuming don't exclude it at
Okay,
this point.
thank you.
Yeah.
We will add that to the list. Thank you. And I'll help with the coordination on the framing group to make sure that those discussions are happening together. Left.
And one thing on the obstacles, I think our plan was to provide internal and external obstacles. So I think we've been talking a lot about external obstacles, but as MDMs, we have some internals that we want to possibly share.
And just for the edification, can you give an example of how inside your organization this data is hard to get?
Because the way, especially if you're a big manufacturer, you have multiple product teams and multiple engineers, as we talked earlier, whether it's developers, they do pull in different source, whether it's open source or others, right? Some of that is not as visible and easy for us to get to, whether it's people have left, it's become legacy, the documentation of that's hard. So that's the part.
The comment says, we'll provide comments later. Yeah,
that one.
All right, I want to move on with Jim and then Duncan and then.
Yeah, I just want to, another example is if we're not all as disciplined as Steve Abrahamson, and we can have already a common list of names, for instance.
Which is a great segue to naming.
And the reason I asked for could we make sure the proof of concept was up there as one of the group's tasks for answers, which I don't see yet up on the board, was so that they would recognize that we'd like that information earlier and perhaps separate from everything else, because I recognize that in the medical field, like, you have to ask the lawyer before you do anything, and therefore waiting for that final report might be later than we might get this input.
That's a great point, and that's something that we should sort of include in the feedback for that working group is, since there is the generate phase and consume phase, the working group can sort of start on processing the generate data while we're waiting till the end of May. Okay. And we just had the great segue of, the things inside an organization as a way of collapsing the namespace. So the namespace problem, I'm going to try to offer sort of a very basic model, which is, are you using com.sun.java or com.oracle.java? We have many different ways of describing a unique piece of software. And so that obviously generates problems if we're trying to think about things in an automated fashion. I don't think there is going to be a single solution, but what I'd like to do is try to capture what are some of the solutions that we have at our disposal now, and what might we want to think about moving forward to help reduce this problem. And I want to start by putting, we'll go to Bruce, and then I want to put Dave on the spot to talk about how he's already tackled this problem. But Bruce, you had a comment first.
So everyone likes to think of there's going to be a unique ID someplace, but there isn't. And basically what we have to do is create alias lists for vendors, products, brand names, probably, because a lot of people don't know what the brand name is, this supplier, and things like that. And probably if you're going to do that, you're going to say, this is a distinguished one I'd like you to use, but I'll accept any of them. If we don't do that, this just isn't going to work based on my experience with trying to do NVD database versus what acquisitions that we've have done, what internal people have done, and so on, and legal, and so on and so forth. So we should just think about it in that way. It's basically alias lists, and then some way to get to the actual supplier, so that for whatever reason.
And just very quickly, when you say we should do this, do you see this is going to be something that each organization will be doing for themselves, that each supplier will be doing to create the alias lists that people can go to it? Do you have an organizational vision? No is a completely good answer. But if you see...
The first organization, I think, is creating at least a situation where the supplier lists they'll hold that.
Oh, so first.org is going to create the sort of the centralized list.
There's a format for this someplace, and Art's, a lot farther ahead on this than my understanding, so you can ask him about that. But once you do that, then I think the individual supplier creates the names for themselves. The problem you're going to have is all these suppliers that are, single name people, of which half of our third-party components are, and what to do about that. But that's a detail that we can solve once we get, the phase one.
So I see JC and Duncan, but I do want to get Dave Waltermeyer, because I know that he spent a lot of time thinking this. He ran CPE and then ultimately was involved in sort of realizing that we need to do something else.
Yeah, so based on our experience with CPE, we know a lot about what not to do.
Can you briefly just give a 30-second CPE for those who may not know it?
Yeah, so CPE is the Common Platform Enumeration. It's a naming standard that's been around for maybe 15 years, 12 years, somewhere in that ballpark. It's currently operated by NIST out of the National Vulnerability Database. Its goal is to provide standardized identifiers for product names, really down to the version level. And what that ultimately means is the NVD analysts create about 90% of the product names. And that's largely done when we see a vulnerability for a product for the first time. Not really the time in which you want to actually identify a software for the first time. It should really be done at the point where a software product is actually released. And so one of the reasons why we actually got involved in SWID tags and product naming and all of that is because of this problem space. So the way we feel is that we should leverage existing mechanisms for uniqueness. One thing you could do is use a UUID as a way that, a method that has enough entropy in it that the likelihood of collision is actually not very high. Another way, which I think Elliot mentioned earlier in the day, was using something like DNS. We already have. I don't see a reason why FIRST or any other organization needs to develop a new list of vendor names when we already have the DNS as a way to effectively provide that for us. And so the guidance that we've provided around this and with related to SWID tags is really to use UUIDs or to prefix to ensure that a value become unique, prefix it with a DNS name as a basis to accomplish that.
And that gives us towards the uniqueness, but it should ultimately be a path to reduce
right. And then I think the other point that you were asking about is another way to do this is to put the authoritative parties in charge of actually providing the information. So instead of the NVD, creating 90% of the product names, basically by doing a forensic dig of the internet to try to discover information about software, it's better for the vendor itself, the software provider, creator, supplier. I was told to use supplier. It's better for that supplier to actually provide the data.
Great. All right, I've got Duncan, JC, Josh has two fingers, and then Elliot.
So first, let the record show that Duncan agrees with Bruce and Dave. Maybe since a lot of people have heard us a lot, that isn't always true. What problem are you trying to solve that we need to make this super unique name? What is the big picture again of what needs to be more consistent? We don't have any at the moment. We're trying to just get going in phase one.
Do you want someone want to take a stab at answering that? Mike? Sorry. Mike, thank you.
Hi, sorry about that. Elliot here. I was going to ask a slightly similar question, which is, what are the properties of a name? It's always something that we always ask this in computer science. What are your security properties? Right? How is the name going to be used? Does it have to be recognizable? I went to the question of uniqueness because it really depends on its use. Does it have to be authoritatively assigned? Can it be randomly assigned? I'm asking these questions without answers. So I think I crassly blurted out domain name, but I don't, even as someone who's a big fan of using that for distribution purposes and declarative purposes, I don't want to jump right there, because I think this is stuff for this room to answer these questions. What properties do you desire? And so I'll leave it at that for now.
So we had JC, and then Josh, and then we'll go over here.
On the entity resolution front, it also depends on the criticality and assurance posture of the system itself. So for some, just getting a supplier might be sufficient. For other systems, you need specifically to understand which mirror site was this particular package taken from. And so again, this raises the need for that extensibility to be there on all of these formats.
And I think, am I correct in saying this is sort of, we have the core of the name, which I'm now going to put air quotes around, and then there are going to be other fields that we imagine be attached to it of sort of where it came from that speak to the pedigree and provenance. Is that right?
Yeah, and there's even the software heritage project
Yes.
and package URL and a lot of attempts to get some really great granularity. It's a little bit of a cold start problem, though. It would be a wonderful thing if everybody used it, but no one does. So, that's an issue.
And can you give us 20 seconds each on software heritage and Perl?
So software heritage is, as I kind of referenced in my overview, it's kind of like the Wayback Machine for software. So what was the version of this at a particular point in time? And it's a kind of really interesting longitudinally auditable repository of metadata about software, which is great, and it's open source. And then the other on package URL, PURL, sort of gets to what Dave Waltermeyer was saying about the deficiencies of CPE, which is since a lot of open source developers don't need no stinking CPE, they don't create them, and there are issues with the CPE even within NVD. There are actually more CPEs in the NVD than there are in the CPE dictionary for the NVD, but that's a whole other issue. So for package URL, the notion is that you would essentially use the vector or the path through the package manager to resolve the location of a particular piece of software. And so you essentially get to more of a geographic understanding of the entity. So it's not really a name, it's an address, right? And addresses are more unique than names. So, if you can essentially get the equivalent of a lat long on a piece of software, that's a more granular and more unique way of identifying it.
Josh.
So the context switched a little bit from what I was going to say, but I'll keep it in mind. It's a bit of a complex point, but I think it's an important one. I said it really quickly in passing, but we want to project into the future a little bit of how the ecosystems will harmonize and adapt to these new objectives. One of them, if we look at the past for an indicator of the future, is there were a lot of malfeasant Java projects on mirror sites. So people started only using Maven Central with canonical binaries instead of maybe getting a bad one. Other things like .NET didn't do that and haven't yet done that. And I said it in passing, but the Linux Foundation's Core Infrastructure Initiative badge has a couple tiers to the badging, and there's criterion for the badging. At least as of this morning, there were 274 projects that have the badge. One could imagine if they added a criterion for an SBOM or a level of SBOM, or a certain percentage can't be opaque or translucent or bioluminescent or whatever other values we add. One could imagine that an average developer sitting down to do something for an FDA-regulated device or a safety-critical thing or a DoD partner would only choose from the logging frameworks that had such a badge. So it's tough to project into the future how this will all look, but one of the incentive problems we saw is these small volunteer open source projects may not have the capital behind them to do a lot of work, but they may want adoption, and one of the ways to get adoption is to supply these things as built and avoid artisanal bespoke things. So there's a lot munged in there, but core infrastructure initiative tagging, type signaling, some sort of accreditation. I mean, we made a joke at the first one about we don't want the names of cows, but we do like grade A beef, right? You know, we do grade certain things, and such a thing could be applied to the software we consume.
Yeah.
No, I withdraw my statement.
All right.
Well, we can go to Jim. You can go ahead, Jim.
Okay, Jim first.
No, I was just saying I withdraw my request to
sorry.
speak. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, then I'll jump in. Yeah, so I can give an actual, example scenario or a real life scenario. So in our SBOM system, we actually do use, excuse me, we actually do use the CPE format. And the reason we went that route was because the initial primary purpose of the SBOM system was to use it to automatically associate vulnerabilities with products, and we have the capability to do that. The challenge is exactly what you indicated in that many software components, until there's a vulnerability, may not have a CPE number. So, on the good side, it is a system that is established. It has a linkage to something that's relevant, so that's very good. There are certain challenges, perhaps, in the way that the CPEs are initially derived or maintained. So that, I think, is something that, if we go that route, that could be worked on. But it is a system, and, we have implemented with the challenges that were indicated. Now, what we do is if we are adding a component to an SBOM that doesn't have an existing CPE, we make up a placeholder that's in that similar format, but not an official CPE. When a CPE is created, then we can flow that update through our system and update our placeholder CPE to the actual CPE.
Art, then Bruce.
So just to kind of go back on something, understanding PURL is more address than perhaps CPE, but looking at them both last night, they're not dissimilar in sort of number of fields and the way they kind of get more specific. So kind of a question, a little bit for argument's sake, if suppliers were behaving as desired and all providing good CPE, would CPE perhaps have just worked and were there other problems with it perhaps, or is it just a matter of it's very expensive for one organization to supply the world's dictionary of CPE?
Yeah, can I answer that?
Please.
Because they're doing it internally.
Because that's getting where we want to go. Yeah.
So the problem with CPE is it sort of has an identity crisis. It's intended to be both an identifier, a matching format, and a metadata format, sort of all munged into a single string. And as a result of that, it does a not so satisfactory job at really addressing all three of those use cases. What we really need is something that is simply just an identifier for a product. And because of all those other things, all that other baggage, maintaining CPEs at an extremely large expense for NIST. And because it hasn't been adopted by industry to the extent that the majority of CPEs are being created by industry partners. If we were to stop supporting CPE today, there would be a small fraction of CPEs that would be created on an ongoing basis, and that just isn't a sustainable model for that kind of effort.
Bruce.
First, I mean, this is not exactly directly on the point, but if we'd known that we could supply CPE names, we would have done that. And I'm sure that would be true of many other vendors. So if you want CPEs done by the vendors, just ask us, and a large percentage of us will do that. But the thing is that the CPE dictionary is really the only thing we have now today, and I like it, and we're adopting it much the way that you guys were doing it, which is basically, we're making them up when there isn't one in there, and using the similar format, and we're adopting the ones that are there. But again, we're using aliases because the vendors change names, the products change names. A unique ID doesn't really help anything here. You just basically have to do aliases, and you can decide the unique ID is an alias, but that's what it is.
So I want to follow on this because I think we've got a couple of different issues, and let's sort of tease them apart. So one is This notion that entities may be in the best position to create their own names, except they may not all use the same format. And so are we okay in a world where we have decentralized that responsibility, but we're still going to have a couple of different ways to do it? And then two, we're still going to have this legacy problem of a bunch of redundant names for the same thing. And so is there a way other than having, centralized alias repositories to move forward on that? Or can we imagine a world where, okay, this is going to be the alias repository, Node will handle the alias repository for Node, and this community will handle the alias repository for its things in that community, and we'll sort of still, again, federate that approach. So I want to sort of tease apart those two issues. So response to that, I've got Elliot and Duncan and then Art.
Yeah, so if you want to look at this horizontally, and I think that's your plan, the naming of, again, I think we're almost putting the cart before the horse a little bit. There's naming of componentry, and there's naming of, and going back to the model that was presented at the end point, there's different levels of naming. So I do wish we could go into the properties a little bit more rather than the solutions, or whether you're using a CPE or something else. And we have distributed ways to do naming. It's not, we can do it, but I'm still not hearing the properties discussion other than, we need to be able to search upon it. I think the one thing I've heard is that we need it to be human readable or something close to human readable. But the other thing I think I'm hearing is it needs to be indexable against a CVE, right? Which is, I think, a key component of the solution that people are aiming for the primary use case. Am I misunderstanding that?
So does anyone want to follow this thread down in terms of we need indexability and we need I don't know what the appropriate information science term is, but A should equal A. We need the property of identity. So, yeah. Cross-referenceability, thank you. So is there any two fingers on what Elliot has said? Yes, Duncan.
So I agree it's use case specific. I agree the use case I care most about is vulnerability, but we did have all of those use cases in the fancy pedal up there. So I think we have to recognize that they're not all the same. I think to Bruce's point, again, on aliases, I don't think we need to come up with a unique way. So Alan's point earlier of, do we have to have a unique way? I don't think we have a unique way. I do think for the vulnerability use case, we do have an existing industry problem that Dave mentioned, that we don't come up with the name for the thing until after it's broke. And that several people have said, hey, we come up with it. We invent our own if they haven't done it. So not totally facetiously, we should maybe consider that it's a vulnerability for a piece of software if it doesn't have it already assigned, and therefore you'd get one assigned for it.
Sorry, and who gets to do the assigning?
Well, that gets into industry. We'll probably have to help. But
this is the big.
Yeah, the bigger issue is I think we have to solve that problem somewhat independent of SBOM. And if we solve it, great.
And I guess we should be very clear of, we should have an actor when we're talking about this. If it isn't going to be completely decentralized, then someone has to do something. Bruce.
Okay, so this is a two-finger one, right? If the CVE organization demanded a CPE when you submitted the CPE, and
give it to the researcher. I love it.
And the only people that are allowed to do CVEs, generally speaking, are the supplier.
Right.
Then I don't see why that can't just be a demand. And most of the mechanistic problems we're talking about here, at least for things that are in NVD, which is what a lot of people are concerned about here, can be resolved, at least severely reducing the amount of overhead that these guys have to put in to create the CPE directories.
Well, so so
we've got Daniel Beard in the queue.
We talked about DNS and the naming convention of the world, and they were able to solve it, right?
So just so you know, NTIA created ICANN in the late 90s, and there's a lot more history about that, but that is a massive institutional global organization.
So my thought is that we have industries that that have a stake in being able to scan products and to identify vulnerabilities. So with that stake, they have to identify by product name and connect to CVE to identify that there is a vulnerability. So my thought is if they had a stake in the game and there was a process that any time a software was developed, that they issue or they manage the issuing of the SWID, a tag, and they identify and keep the centralization of all the software by tag number, because they have a stake in the game. Mm-hmm. So I'm just trying to think, I guess, jump into the solution.
So I'm going to go to Art and then Daniel Beard on the phone.
This is, I think, wrapping back to, I think Bruce kicked this off, and there were sort of two parts to what he was saying. On the aliases part, so fully agree with that class of problem. It's occurred to me that we've talked about references for saying, component A includes or is compiled from component B. One of the ways I looked at this a while back internally was component A relationship is, otherwise known as or also known as. Is this solvable with just a relationship that you can just say, Solaris 5 equals Sun OS 5. I forget why they match up, but just, right. You could do it that way without having to have a separate special magical aliases field. Question for those who have thought about this, yeah.
Anyone have an immediate response?
Generic relationship function that I can do lots of things with also has alias to, alias of.
Elliot.
Yeah, this is something. The more I think about it, the more I think this has to be left to tooling, and you're going to need the aliasing for a while. But I keep coming back to a couple of things in my own head, which is Python provides a certain way to do this. The various software update systems provide a certain way to do this. So I think a certain amount of thought has to go into the flexibility of this, and again, I'm hesitant to give more recommendations on the spot, but I'm thinking in terms of that line, because a lot of these, the reason I'm there is, in terms of the, that all the way to the left guy who wrote some crappy little piece of procedure code that somebody wanted to borrow in God help us JavaScript, for some purpose that he had no idea you were going to use it in your MDM. Right? He was never going to go to anybody to get this information. But if he wrote, if he wrote it in Python, for instance, at least he had the sense to create a setup.py file, and you might be able to derive some information there as an example. So I think some thought needs to go into it.
Great. Daniel Beard, often a man with thoughts. We can hear you.
Well, I had one, and then right as I pushed *1, Alan, you basically said what I was going to say, which kind of happened, is that when you're doing software development, there's package managers now for any language, NPM for Node, NuGet for .NET, pip for Python, and typically that's where a lot of the third-party libraries are coming in. So doing a federated approach is something we can leverage right now, because these names already have to be unique within their namespace.
So what I'm hearing is we've got federation, we've got aliases for the short run, and we've heard from Josh that there probably will be some convergence as we move forward. I've got Dave, and then I've got JC. I
just wanted a few points. I wanted to reiterate, I think using package managers is a swell idea here, because that's something that can actually happen at build, / packaging time, which is, I think, one of our desired outcomes for this effort. I wanted to talk to a comment that Bruce had about, why doesn't CVE just mandate, that folks provide a CPE? So I'm a CVE board member, so is Art. We're about to start going through a CNA rules revision process, and part of that is about setting what the standards of practice are for, what constitutes a CP, what are the required fields. So we're starting to have more conversations about what additional data can we get from the CNAs that are assigning vulnerabilities. Product information is certainly part of that. It's always a juggle as to how much you require, because the higher the bar, the less people you get signing up to actually do the work. But we're going to have a conversation about that in this cycle, so maybe some progress can be made. And then I want to touch on one thing that Duncan was saying about use cases. I think it's really important that what we do actually allow organizations to map across use cases. It's not enough to simply just provide an identifier that can be used within a given use case. Because in a lot of organizations today, I have a vulnerability management tool that identifies software one way, I have a configuration management tool that does it another, a license management way that does it a third. And really to address some more advanced cybersecurity use cases, you need to be able to synthesize data across all of these different information sources. Like, why are my folks running software that's unlicensed and unpatched? Those are the kinds of questions that I should be able to answer, and I can't do that if I can't connect these data sources, and I can't connect the data sources if I don't have a common way of identifying software.
JC.
So in certain cases, those manifest and dependency files are not present. And so you have to account for the known unknowns in that case. The other thing is that I agree that package managers are awesome to use. We have also detected package managers do get compromised as well. So, for that reason, it is very important to understand when a package manager is taking source code in clean and spitting it out dirty.
Okay. So I want to sort of try to tie this up in a little bit, but Duncan, 2 fingers.
So just a clarification on my use case, because I do agree with what Dave said. So I want to be clear. I think for any given thing that needs to be done, there should only, if possible, be one way to do it. We might agree to disagree at times, but at least, and then we might have to have 2 ways to do it, but we should try to minimize the number of ways to do a given thing. But my point was that not all particular, I'm going to call them fields, not all fields apply to all use cases. I don't want the requirements for the nuclear launch code software to have to be put into webcams in my house. That's more the point I was making. Different use cases require the different things. So when we get to Elliot's point of, hey, what do we need this for? It is dependent, and we do need to make the superset, but we do have to be careful that, again, perfection is the enemy of the good. To Josh's earlier point, we want to get some stuff out.
Okay. So I've got Art, and then Daniel, I think you're back in the queue.
Okay. I'll be very quick. This is Art. So JC, I think, just said this. I want to reiterate it. We talked about in our first question of the afternoon the unknown thing, and as a supplier trying to play by the new rules, I'm going to make a placeholder invented by me ID for someone else's thing because they haven't provided it yet. So that's a case where there may or may not be a package management system. I've got to make up some nearly arbitrary name for someone else's thing, and that's something we're going to have during transition. Yep. So we need a generic ID system. And also, that's all. Yeah.
Speaking to that, so that
connect the questions. Yeah.
So let's sort of start to lay out what the work to be done is going to be. Since I think I was hoping someone would magically solve this problem, so given that, we're going to need what Art just said, which is, hey, when you're doing this, when you're rolling it yourself, we should have some guidance on what naming looks like, and then we should also have some description of what an organization that is creating something new, building on what we already have from NIST and Perl, I think are probably the two, if there's another approach of saying, hey, here's the guidance that we already have in naming, and if the group wants to put some normative judgment on the existing guidance, that's great, but I think we want to start with Dr.
I will add, as much as we love to beat up on CPE, and it's a great piñata, the elements of it, we have found very useful running more sophisticated entity resolution capabilities. So we can actually use, if two of those things are provided, we can bounce them off against various automated capabilities to get the other ones. And so it actually is a very useful framework if you've got a big engine in the back doing entity resolution, just saying.
Dave and Elliot.
I was just saying, as far as work to be done, I would like to revisit what Elliot had suggested earlier, which is we should maybe describe what are the characteristics of an identifier that are actually desirable. Because then I think guidance simply follows on from that. You know,
11, if you like.
Good.
Yeah.
The one thing I want to cover is also make sure we're adding who's using the name and who's asserting the name and how that assertion is being secured.
All right. We're going to second Elliot to whichever working group is going to pick that up. And is a good fit for the framing, or is there another?
Elliot did just register for our mailing list. So.
Excellent.
And we're meeting tomorrow at 11, so we could handle it somewhere else. Okay.
And
every Friday, yeah, all right.
And I have Daniel from the ceiling.
Oh, no, it's fine.
Oh, sorry. I didn't see you again for a while, so thank you for your patience. All right, so we're going to try to capture some of that, and we have the notes that we sort of captured here of sort of, first, let's be more explicit about the problem we're trying to solve, as folks brought up, and then we'll move from there. All right, so the next challenge to tackle is what was on my list? What is there we go. The act of sharing. So, and by the way, these are getting harder as we go on. So, so this is vision of, hey, there's data, but we imagine the data flowing down the supply chain. How does it actually transit? There are some cases where we can tell a fairly straightforward story. So the model behind SWID has always been that the data ships with the binary. And so you put a binary on a platter, it's just going to have, as part of the installer, right, David? The installer puts the SWID there, so it's always handy. That's challenging for embedded devices, although Dave's fixing that one too in the IETF with CoSWID. But there are other challenges we may want to think of. So one, this was something that came up earlier today, which is, do we want to draw a distinction between the software build side of the supply chain and the last mile of going from the final supplier to the owner operator who's going to have a slightly different set of use cases? Does it make sense to think of them as separate issues? Or should we try to say, hey, listen, we're just going to think of all of it as going from supplier to next person? I've got 1, 2, 3.
You don't always know who your last mile is, and your last mile can have another mile and another mile and another mile. So I think you have to bake in the end model. Separately, though, while the mic's on, the thing most of our conversations forget when we talk about the act of transparency is that if it is a web resource like Bruce and I might want for our attestation part, web resources are sometimes unavailable. Sometimes they go out of business. Sometimes you're in a air-gapped environment where you can't look these things up. We should make no assumption that we will have universal access and pervasive access to a resource that isn't bundled together.
All right. Jim.
You know, I was just going to say that the model that we're talking about, where you're depending upon your previous supplier in the chain having done the same thing, means that we should continue the same format all along, basically.
Good.
So I think there are a couple of Bom acquisition use cases that we're talking about. I think one thing that we definitely want to support is if I hold a piece of software, as built probably, I need to have some definitive way of being able to find the SBOM for that if it exists. So that could be that the SBOM is bundled with that software, or that some URL or resource identifier is made available. I think there's ways to deal with resources in a way that addresses the air gap problem that was brought up. So that's certainly, I think, the first required use case. I think there's also a secondary use case where that we don't often talk that much about, which is there are lots of reasons that organizations need to know something about the collection of software that an organization has, because they're vulnerability managers and they want to know, what software versions are available that I can pick from, and I want to understand what vulnerabilities are present in those. There's organizations like the NVD that are trying to do value-added analysis of vulnerabilities, and we need to be able to attribute that to a given software. I think there's another use case where vendors could actually host a repository of their own SBOMs to make those publicly available. And ideally, that would be done in a standardized way.
This is the suppliers hosting.
Yeah, the suppliers. Yes, sorry. Old habits. But I think it's important that that be done in a standardized way because it's information that's effectively unusable if I have to implement 10 different access methods to actually retrieve it, or hundreds, or whatever, right?
Les, Jim.
I think, and maybe it's just me, but I think we need to define as built because everybody determines that differently. There's as built, there's as installed, there's as configured, there's as. So can we define as built before we go?
And I don't want to do that now just because that is a known open question that I think Art touched on, which is where/when do you generate your SBOM and what exactly is it referring to? I'm going to kick it over to Art and then I'm going to go to Josh for his two-finger.
I considered that stable, but perhaps that was a mistake. So we could talk about it in the framing group, no problem.
Josh.
To Dave's point about this should be a standard repository access method or whatnot, I didn't think we were going to try to define that here, but I do agree. Some of the regulators I have spoken to don't like this suggestion, but I think it's maybe part of their public safety mandate that if there's a bunch of medical device makers that go out of business and they have the opportunity to have all of these in one place and could do safety notifications to hospitals that this vulnerability affects these 12 out of business MDMs. I think there's those purviews and opportunities. It could be an ISAC or an ISAO for the sector. It could be a sector coordinating council. But there may be natural custodians of the superset, even if they're sensitive information. It doesn't have to be public, but it may be really smart for us to have this done by certain custodians.
Duncan, two fingers, then Jim.
Well, just on the terminology issue, I'd actually propose that you add another, we have these various topics we're going to discuss this afternoon. I think a whole different topic that should be added at the end is the terminology and input to the framing group, which is the one I think that owns terminology, and just a list, not to solve them here, but to give hey, if you're going to use these terms, let's get them commonly defined or whatever, because we have in the framing group discussed fit for use and fit for purpose, decided that, hey, we can't use those terms because they're legal, so we'll never use them again, and then I saw them twice in the view graphs today. So if we're going to use things, we need to define them. Thank you.
It's a good thing to flag. Jim?
So Josh actually stole some of my thunder. Sorry about that. Don't mean to call you out. But, one of the things we have been talking about is whether or not ISAOs, for instance, can source this data. And for industries that have ISAOs in place, it's a good solution to it because then it doesn't depend upon the vendor not only providing the data at the time, but also providing the infrastructure in order to expose that data, to make it transparent.
Thank you.
So this might be slightly off topic, but in the interest of transparency, right? So we talk about suppliers of SBOMs as the people sort of giving you the software, but as as an SCA vendor, right, we're analyzing other people's things and trying to generate SBOMs. So is there terminology that has to come down for not only who is the supplier of the software itself, but who is actually the supplier of the SBOM that's being generated, right? And so and how we share that, right? Like who is the source of this SBOM and where is it coming from?
So this came up a little bit earlier with the notion of translucent data or different sources of data. and I think we've talked about how that can fit into both SWID and SPDX in terms of authorship. Yes.
So as a supplier, I almost certainly am going to host SBOMs on my own website and distribute it with the products. I think it would be pretty interesting for a centralized type repository. I'm thinking like the Cloud Security Alliance Star Registry as an example, where people voluntarily submit to it. There's some interesting, not to go back to the previous section, but if we're going to have overlapping names or different names for different components, you could actually do, I almost said machine learning, but let me say a classifier of some sort to say, these groups are saying XML2 and this says libxml2. Maybe that's the same thing, and we can actually sort of converge on a single name for some of these components if you had it all in one place.
And I think that speaks to some of the aliasing work that we were talking about earlier of collecting that data. So we've got this interesting challenge where on one hand there are unique enough use cases and different interests that we're going to have different approaches to solving. There isn't going to be a single way to do this. At the same time, I think seems to be a number of you came up with saying we should have, if not centralized, at least federated approaches. So we shouldn't decide what they are, but we should think about building that capacity in so that if different organizations wanted to do that, they could have that role. Is there a way to take this and turn it into a small manageable space so that there are, here are 6 ways of doing this?
So there's an IETF standard that I worked on called ROLI. It's RFC 8322, which basically describes a protocol, an exchange protocol in a metadata format for representing arbitrary, what we're calling security automation information. One type of which is, an SBOM. And so that's a protocol that would more or less standardize how you would represent that on the wire, how you would establish the site.
So is this a transport layer protocol, or is this a sort of an organizational who's putting it and where?
It's a transport protocol with the assumption that this data is actually federated. And it's built on top of AtomPub, which is a syndication format. So the idea is that if multiple organizations sort of federate their own data, through syndication, you could actually coalesce that into, more centralized repositories as well.
Further thoughts? Anyone want to sort of imagine from a user perspective? So we've had a couple of folks saying, all right, if I'm generating the data, here's what I want. What about if you're using the data? How would you sort of want to get it? Push, pull?
Consistent.
Consistent.
Yeah.
So you would like to have a very small set of ways that the data is available to you.
Yes. I don't want every MDM to have their own way of sharing me the data so that I have to create a gigantic system to collect it.
Good. No, and I think that's one of the challenges if we sort of say we're going to federate it, but without the institutions that are going to do that federation. Art, then Duncan.
Yeah, just very briefly to that point, the rough thinking at the framing group is we're sort of hoping or aiming for is, 2 formats. One would be perhaps better, but there's two formats, multiple ways to get it. To your point, yes, still having many ways to transfer it and receive it is still a problem. But at least if you have 3 or 4 collectors, you're getting the same data. But I don't see a way. Well, sector specific it might work. If you're talking medical devices, there might be a system within that ecosystem that is consistent, and you're good to go, right? At the sort of framing working groups level of we want the idea is I'm transferring the component to my downstream, and with that component is the as-built document that manifests for it. So I want that to go or be available at that time, however it gets transferred. But I think it's about as far as the framing group's going to be able to say. But further down in the weeds, sector-specific, device-specific, regular software that has lots of file system space can just do what SWID and SPDX does and have the files run on the system there. But at a high level, we're going to have to say something general, I think, like provide it consistently at the time of handoff or delivery. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful and think in terms of the past, how things used to work, and there are lots of problems. Phase one, what we want to work immediately, and what we want to work further down the road. And I think one issue that's a little conflated in what we just discussed is the tooling topic, which is next up on the list that we haven't got to yet. Because what I think I heard you say is not necessarily you want it all in a common way. You want tooling that supports doing what you need to do, which is not the same question.
That's a very good distinction. Well, let's look at this from the supplier perspective then. How would you like to share it? Is this...
Define a format and we'll put it out that way.
So we've got the format, but when you say put, I guess what we're trying to get is what do you mean put it out? Is this like you're just going to have a canonical part on
We'll make it
website?
downloaded in Excel files. We'll make it available in some sort of REST interface. We'll just define it. We'll do it.
All right.
I think I'm just the one thing I do worry about is we have a joke on our team that if you've seen one medical device patching process, you've seen exactly one medical device patching process. Yes. And what we don't want to see on the HDO side is 300 different ways of doing it. So we build a book of figuring out where everybody's SBOMs are, and then hope that they never change them because re-indexing all of this is going to be cumbersome.
So, comment on both of them is I think when you say we, I think you're saying I, because at the moment, yeah. Okay.
Bruce also has my proxy, so he's speaking. No.
So what I mean is I'm not trying. What I'm getting at is I understand what you're saying when you say, give it to me one way. The whole patching, I get that whole. One MDM, one patching, you got it, right? If we don't come up with some way of trying to, and all of us come to it, or you guys come to an agreement on the consumer side of that, of how we would produce these to you, you will get it 300 different ways handed to you. And that we becomes a bunch of 300 I's, right? We'll give it to you. Give me a spreadsheet, and I'll give it to you, but I'm going to give it to you one way, and he's going to give it to you another way.
And that's what we're trying to get. So we've
right.
got,
so I think one way is good. Yeah.
So I said we because I was thinking about the CNA, the CVE effort, and we're getting pretty good, on that. I mean, it's not just us; it's lots and lots of people that put in CVEs, and they're defining a format, and people are pretty much adopting to that, or formats, I should say, and I think that you'll get that. If we can tie it to CVEs particularly for things like that, at least the naming parts and things like that, I think we can make great progress there. And as far as saying I meant large manufacturers. I'm sorry, I should have.
Well, I'm a large manufacturer.
I was being presumptuous.
But I'm saying we. I mean, but
I would say that would apply to us and Cisco and Microsoft and IBM for at least.
All right, so that's a small number of companies, but they're important. They're large in market share, but still, again, from the total quantity of vendors, we're trying to sort of see how we can collapse the space. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I forget who I pointed to when I said 1. Oh, yeah, gee, hey.
I'm number 1. Yeah, one thing to consider in this discussion as well is that we're talking about the SBOM and how do we make the SBOM available in some kind of efficient, consumable format for HDOs. And I think my friend Tim from Mayo would be the first to admit that's not the only element of product information that they're looking at. So when we're sharing information, we need to expand that, which may be beyond the scope of this group, but we need to consider that HDOs are looking for information well beyond the SBOM. Things like the answers and comments with MDS2 questions and other things. So the extent to which we can make all that relevant information available in some consumable way, that's where we get benefit. If we have just like we don't want multiple solutions for SBOMs for different use cases, we don't want a solution to share SBOM information, a solution to share MDS2 information, et cetera.
Can I flip that question around? Are there existing channels that you're using already? Is this done?
No.
No, for the data that you're sharing. Is it done pretty much bespoke?
Yeah, I think each manufacturer has a mechanism to do it. We typically have portals where we put our version of the information in our format, but eventually, the good news is that early on in this journey toward secure healthcare, there hasn't been that much information to share, so it hasn't become a huge problem. As we have more information, more SBOMs, more MDS2 data, more patches on a regular basis, it's going to become much more of a need.
So collapsed communication channels when possible, so we'll keep an eye out for things that are already happening. 2, yes.
Right here. I heard the concern about 300 ways to consume SBOMs as a vendor. Whichever method I pick is going to be wrong because I'm going to have 1,500 customers that all want to consume it in a different way as well. So no matter what I do, they're not going to like it. We all have websites. If we could define something like a REST API with a well-known URL that said this is the place where we've all agreed by convention or we've agreed by standard, this is a place where you can find these things. We're not a standards body here. That might have to be an IETF type thing, but that could be one way to go about it.
So having a shared website. Number 3, right? Sorry, number 3, yes, thank you.
So Rolly is a REST-based API with a well-known URL. So, it's also a generalized approach that can work with many different kinds of information. So, it was effectively designed to be able to support publication of like vulnerability information and configuration information that relates to products. And there's no reason that it couldn't also be extended to, to support some of the medical device use cases as well. I just kind of wanted to reiterate, though, what I was hearing in the room, which is, there seems like there is some desire to at least look at where there are standardized ways to share SBOM information. Does that mean in the formats and standards working group that we should maybe spend some time looking at that too?
I think that one of the things that we've been looking at with SPDX and SWID is like, here's what's most commonly consumed.
Yeah.
And then the question is, does that meet the need?
Well, but I think what we're talking about here goes beyond the format of how you express the SBOM data. It's more about how do you discover SBOM data that's out on the internet per se, and then how do you share it across communications channels?
Sorry. There were a bunch of people in the queue, so we've got Jim, and then Josh, and then JC, and then
Jonathan.
So I'm next, right?
Yes.
Just making sure. So in thinking about a federated approach, it has 2 advantages. One is it prevents Mayo from having to have a book of how to access each supplier's SBOM and maybe other information. But also, I think of the small medical device manufacturer who doesn't have to build up an infrastructure just to be able to serve up. I know it's not very complex, but there are a lot of very small shops where they're focusing on providing medical device technology, not on and they may be handcrafting an SBOM because they only have to do it once every 6 months or something like that. And so a federated approach would help them out too.
We just need to have federation that actually covers enough of the different spaces.
Right.
Josh.
To the original question, as a producer of SBOMs, which I am, how do I want to produce them? I don't want to be completely redundant with Bruce, but my different markets I serve are going to want to consume it a little differently. So as long as I have the content, I can vary the presentation layer of the content. I do think I'm going to have to remind everybody once again that if it's solely a web resource, then it doesn't help the air-gapped offline networks. It doesn't help once you go out of business. It doesn't help when we have internet outages. So I believe I'm going to communicate this plural ways. One will probably be shipped with my installer. One will probably be on my support portal. One of them will probably be a REST API or something like what you're talking about on my website. And I also want to clarify the noun or the subject of the sentence, because the SBOM inventory, minimum viable inventory, or whatever we're calling it, I think should move around the way I just described. As far as my current best attestation as to exploitability, that should be on the web, because that's ephemeral or will change upon the revelation of new information, whereas the other one is static and true all the time. So which thing we're sharing may dictate how we're sharing. I wouldn't want to give my CVE listing in a static way at build time because it's going to be different a week from now. Right. So which thing we're sharing may dictate how we share.
JC, you still have?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that a lot of this stuff can go into our kind of next kind of how-to guide, that Standards and Formats produces, and is, like we can get to this.
Great. So, and I think we're going to try to task that with saying, all right, collect what is out there with an emphasis on what's being used. So like Rolly's being used for a bunch of other stuff, then that's fantastic. We will sort of ride on top of all of that. Jonathan.
So I'd be a proponent of having a central area, at least from the medical device industry, where SBOMs and CBOMs would be located as the source of truth. Understanding the industry, once you put things out there for public consumption, it gets on the internet, it becomes someone's Bible because they found it, hey, this is the SBOM for this product. I was thinking that the FDA is going to require the submittal of an SBOM, CBOM, whatever bomb, a bomb, and not to say that they are the central repository of truth, but they're certifying the product, at least from a medical perspective.
Not just a thought. Just Seth is going to do it.
So,
yes. All right. I want to make sure that we have time to touch on the tooling side. So we're going to sort of delegate this to the Standards and Formats group with the notion that this is going to be sort of one of the things that is going to be working on possibly for the next rev. All right. Let's give 10 minutes to thinking about the tooling side. And I want to start off with one of these lovely questions that we always come to, which is, hey guys, when we're talking about this, what do we mean? So the things that have come up that I've seen seem to be fitting into the large buckets of tooling to produce this stuff. So let's get this into IDEs. Let's get this into build management tools, things like that. And then let's focus on how we can automate the consumption of SBOM data. So getting this into vulnerability management tools, getting this into your internal development tools that are sort of building your whitelisting and things like that. Are there other categories or things that you guys want to sort of add on to this list when we talk about tooling?
Hi, my name is Ed Hyman. I'm with Abbott Laboratories. So I think I can give you a little bit of practical comments around the producing as from a medical device manufacturer who's participating in the SBOM proof of concept. So when you talk about producing and tooling, I think it's kind of interesting, at least for me, to note that there's a little bit of a difference with a manufacturer versus maybe a supplier being software only, in that not only do we have software and hardware that composes our product that ultimately gets delivered, installed, and configured. So there's really at least two steps to that. One is software we build, and software that's somewhat built in the traditional manner of I have an iterative build process, I've hooked tooling into it. I think you could certainly put tooling we've talked about that could help identify and manage and establish the content of our application. But there's also an activity around I'm defining the platform it actually runs on, right? So it's a Windows operating system with 10, 15, 20, 30 other components that are all part of the platform that ultimately then we install our software on. So I think you have to kind of consider, we're really getting it from two sources. One, the application we built, and one, the platform we defined.
That's helpful. And I think that's sort of something that we want to make sure we capture in the whiteboard model that the framing group has been doing.
Yeah, and can I add one other, because I kind of saved
Please,
this as well.
you've been holding them all in all day.
But yeah, well, I kind of wanted to wait for the other discussion. And so once again, kind of a practical comment, as I think really was confirmed by Steve and even Jim, is that I think ultimately, and this may not just be specific quote to a manufacturer, but there certainly is a identifier mapping activity that has to take place within our organization. So as we establish, here's what we will identify the Windows embedded 8.1 operating system, here's how we will identify Windows 10 or whatever it may be. If we're developing multiple products, then we've got a mapping activity where at least internally we've got to identify this is what we call it. So then we can handle multiple aliases that Bruce and others have identified that ultimately when it's time to produce the SBOM, we may have to either pick and choose, we may have to generate more than one, but it's all going to have to take, internally we're going to have to establish what that mapping is, how we manage a mapping until either the industry catches up or establishes a final identifier, or we just have to be able to manage multiple.
Great, thank you. And that, I think, gets the federated thing that we were talking about earlier. Other approaches when you guys say, hey, we should really be focusing on making sure this is something that we can build into. Bruce.
One other item on that is that eventually somebody's building the very bottom component.
Yes.
And
oh, sorry, your mic, please.
A lot of times, there's somebody that's building the very bottom component. And it would really be good if the tools make it very easy for them to just identify this is the bottom level and here's its name. Because, as I earlier said, half of our third-party components are supported by somebody with a single name. And I'd like to make it easy for them because that really cuts down the problems a lot for everybody.
So this is make sure whoever's writing left pad has something that will just automatically pre-populate or give him the tools to name it and things like that.
Really easy, free tool, download and run it. Yep.
And that, again, I think builds on what we were talking about earlier with sort of the trying to rely on some of the ecosystems that already exist for that. Dave.
I mean, but what I heard you say, though, is that we need some party to agree to a name for, for this thing and then share it with everyone else. Why can't the thing just name itself, and that folks stop coming up with new names for things and just use the name that it's providing? I mean, doesn't that simplify things dramatically than having to appoint someone to centrally manage something and then have to keep everything in sync all the time?
I'm not saying that the supplier can't name it. I'm not sure what name itself means, but if by that you mean the supplier names it, I think that's fine. But the supplier should try their very best to make it unique or provide an aliasing facility if it isn't.
And the other thing I wanted to clarify is by root node, do you mean like some leaf node that everyone depends on, or are you talking about the end of the line, the software that is actually running on someone's system?
I think he's talking about the leaves.
I may be the oddball out here, but the tree is standing upside down to me. So I say OpenSSL or LeftPad are root nodes. There's nothing further back.
Meaning that it's the end of the roots.
Yes, the leaf.
The roots are the leaf is the HDO. The leaf is the HDO who builds no software themselves, only consumes things.
Sorry.
The root is OpenSSL or LeftPad who only writes their own software. I'm happy to flip my mental tree around, but let's, yeah.
For the point, so we don't have to get into a metaphorical discussion.
Sorry, the tree is upside down, it's easy.
An atomic package is an atomic component is one that contains no further subcomponents. A monad,
and they should name themselves, hopefully. They might not be doing it, which is the problem. We have to name it for them because they aren't doing it. But ideally, they would name themselves, and we just use that name, and we're done.
All right. We don't have to belabor this because I just want us to start thinking about this as we move into phase N, and that's going to set us up for our next discussion. But just want to say, hey, we're talking about this.
So again, it gets into which use cases, because I believe the database that Bruce referred to was their licensing database, which probably uses a lot of software from single developers. Like now that I'm an old retired guy, I write software and put it out in open source, and some people actually use it occasionally. However, I would not recommend that any of them ever use I don't compile things for people. I put my open source out them and let them compile it. And that does make this problem a little bit trickier, because when you do take several components and compile them yourself, that's really when the name we're talking about, at least in the vulnerability use case that we're talking about. We're talking about the name associated with the raw, uncompiled code in the licensing use case, which is, for lack of a better term, I'll call it an earlier point in the pipeline. And we're talking about the vulnerability package name at the point of the executable, which is usually made at the build time, particularly if you're in the nuclear launch code business and you want the full provenance and everything. So unfortunately, it does become a little gray because of the use case issue.
Jim?
Yeah, this all keeps coming back to me to this model of iteration where every step in the chain has to be well behaved. So I would say that what we really should be coming up with as one of our deliverables is a very concise description of what it takes to be a well-behaved supplier, which means not only providing the SBOM, but naming yourself appropriately, however that's defined.
Good. And Art, you're nodding enthusiastically. I feel like that's something that's going to be in the framing group. And we will
please add stuff
to think about that. I think that's
please add stuff like the badging, right? The free market, like scoring, like CII.
But I think it's once we have the recursive step that everyone can follow, then we can hook into all of the other efforts that are going on around the world of how do you be a well-behaved actor in the software ecosystem. All right. I want to move on now to make sure we have a chance to talk about this overall process, because one of the things we heard this morning is, what do we want to get done now as sort of a phase one, getting minimum viable out there, with the real acknowledgement that it's not going to be complete. It's not going to be the final perfect thing. It's going to be a good enough, and we want to do two things. One, we need to get it out there, and two, it needs to be built in a way that we can refine it later on. And I wondered, does anyone have a vision beyond what I've just described of what you'd like to see for sort of the version 0.1 that we're going to release to the world? Of what you would like from this?
Well, I just want to point out that maybe we're in a slightly different category in the proof of concept, because what we're going to be delivering primarily is information that will inform the rest of the groups, as well as talking about the experience with the public.
Definitely. No, it's a really good point. I'm speaking primarily to the working groups, and I've, as a shorthand, as I've done briefings for a bunch of different folks in DC and around the country, sort of describing the work that you all done as the what, the why, and the how. And so getting the first level up there of what is an SBOM, why are we doing it, and then how do we do it? John.
This even came up at lunch talking to a member of the press, but there continues to be, despite our efforts, a massive conflation between the pilot's goals and the minimum viable product definition. And I think we must have explained it 50 times in the last couple months, but we have to be crystal clear that your pilot is to shake out surprises on the creation and or consumption in an HDO MDM pair up, but not to be the minimum viable product from this initiative. And I don't know how to say it differently, but I just implore people, it continues to be very confusing to folks. And then it's added to by the fact that, there's that looming point that FDA says if we produce something useful in time, they will use it. So they'll be like the first proof of what the minimum viable product is or isn't. And I feel we may have a slight race condition now that I've framed it that way, which is I really do want to see what they encounter in the tabletop exercise before we codify that this was minimum viable product. So there might be a slight Gantt chart mismatch here, or impedance mismatch, that we should factor into our June target, is all I'm saying.
And no, I think that's a great point. I blame the lawyers. Certainly, all the work that the proof of concept had done was sort of set up to be underway by now. Would have gotten away with it if it wasn't those pesky lawyers.
Let me just follow up on that. So we've said from the start that we're not trying to define the minimal viable product, right?
I'm not criticizing you. I'm remarking on the level of confusion in spite of our best efforts.
And this goes even all the way back to the first meeting where it chose the word proof of concept rather than pilot exactly for that reason. So one tentative timeline could be the notion that by June, we would have some draft deliverables by the framing, use cases, and standards group. In the standards group, it might even be 2 deliverables. And we would have time to have input from the proof of concept on the generating the data by then. But the notion is these would be very much drafts that are mature enough to get much broader feedback. So they're polished enough that we feel comfortable sharing them, but making very clear that they are drafts for input. I've got a 2-finger from David and Art as well.
This will be quick. I don't think I have it in my notes, but does the healthcare pilot have an estimate of when the exercises may commence?
Yeah. So we expect to have the SBOMs completed, ready to go by the end of this month, and then by the end of May to have fully executed. Not finished our report, but fully executed.
And will that be in your normal meeting cycle, or will we be holding out of cycle sort of events or something for that? If I wanted to come to your tabletops, how would I do that?
We haven't.
The HDOs are going to be doing them internally. It's not going to be public. And then they're going to share out their lessons. Right. And in fact, there are 2 nested groups. And you guys who are participating, do you want to sort of talk about your trust relationships? Like there's the NDA, which is between the hospitals and the manufacturers. And then they're going to report out to the working group, which has a broader group.
I'll just join the working group, and that'll be my answer. So
I would also add to that the HDOs have their own processes.
Exactly.
So it's not a constant across all of the participants.
It's a feature, not a bug.
As well as the MDMs are creating their SBOMs as best they can to the formats that are requested, but they may not be all the same. And that's part of discovery.
Duncan.
Yeah, so if I could reiterate my previous concern, I recognize that those final reports, because they're being generated under NDAs, they got to be reviewed by lawyers. They're not going to make it in time for the other people's June deliverables. So if there's anything that can be done, like some of the manufacturers right now are creating SBOMs and running into issues. If there's anything being done that we can have a mechanism to get that output out of them and into the other groups to answer the questions that you all now know the other group's going to be spending the next 2 months on, it would be very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, we already mentioned the fact that we should collect and report out on the MDM experience of creating the SBOMs for us. And we'll bring that into the meeting next week.
Thank you. Dave.
So one clarifying question. So would you be willing to come to some of the other working groups and do that out brief? Because not all of us attend every working group meeting. And unfortunately, I've had a standing conflict with the healthcare working group, so I haven't been able to participate. I mean, if there are findings, I think, that are useful for the other working groups, it would be really useful to go there to share those findings.
I'm happy to help facilitate that so that we don't overload the HDOs, but certainly we can get a selection of the manufacturers that are generating this and try to make sure that we've got some out briefings as soon as possible.
And then I had another question. So for these public drafts, what's the sort of characteristics of these drafts that you would like to see? Like how done is done, how drafty, how complete, Any thoughts on that?
So that is a fantastic question. and really it sort of turns back to you because the next setup was going to be to sort of have a discussion about the audiences. They should be complete enough that people don't feel their time is being wasted reading them. So this also includes editing. For those of you who read lots of other people's documents, a good sign. It's sort of hard not to take it personally when someone gives you a poorly edited document. But also just polished to the point where we're as clear as possible. So we have done some internal wordsmithing and made sure that, yeah, we've all talked about this. So not every single sentence needs to be committee-sized, but what I'm going to say is part of that timeline for getting that draft ready will include some working groups where you actually have a conversation of how do we make this sentence better. That level of detail, while acknowledging that, hey, ultimately we're going to be getting feedback from other people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and Alan, if I could just add, try to make them so that someone who hasn't been participating understands what you're talking about at every point in your document.
Yeah, what's the target group? I guess what's the target group for reading it?
We're going to, I want to touch on that in a second because that's something that I think has to come from each group and having input from this body of what's the audience. But I've got a two-finger here and I've got a microphone on there.
So if I could add to the end of your sentence, including what is in phase one versus what is further down the road with a focus on phase one. Do remember what was said earlier, that the FDA is looking to use some of this, so there's at least one use case on a much tighter time frame than many of the other uses are. So if we could try and meet their needs, because recognize, as Alan said earlier, governments do govern. If we don't get them the input, they're just going to pick. So let's get them what we can.
Thanks.
Not that the SBOM proof of concept becomes the de facto when it's done, which is we're trying not to make. FDA has been very flexible, and even though it becomes something in a guidance that's SBOM or CBOM, whatever you guys want to say it, is there's going to be a period of time of that thing being fettered out anyways. So there won't be.
What I'm saying is we don't have to solve all the other industries and all the other use cases by June. We can just decide, defer that to phase two if it will get us better output by June.
Exactly. The NDAs, to answer your question earlier, the NDAs for internally for the participants was just for us to make sure we shared. We mentioned that earlier, right? For what the summaries would be that come out of that, it's just a matter of not providing proprietary information outside of that. It's to provide everything we've learned. And on the June draft deliverables and having input from the proof of concept, can we make that more the end of June?
Well, let's we'll drive into the calendaring in just a little bit, but I think that's an important thing to acknowledge. So we'll flag that. But what I wanted to sort of try to capture is what really came out earlier, which is that we've got phase one, and do we think we have an idea of what that looks like? And then two, question that was just raised, which is, hey, what do we think the audiences are going to be? Right? This is going to be your chance to take the work that's happening. You know, NTI is a small agency. This, in the scheme of it, is a fairly small process that is purporting to offer guidance to the entire digital world. And so we're going to want to sort of say, hey, here's our vision, and get feedback. And so we want to make sure that that's something that we can try to have an internal audience in our heads of who's going to be reading this. Josh.
I was also going to urge for late June, but in terms of phased approaches, having been on the receiving end of some very heated fear and trepidation over being cut out of scope from DoD, for example. I got a lot of calls over vacation weekend. If we do talk about phased, we should do some expectation management of what phase two can't be never or a question. I think the notion of phase should be, a bit of a consensus here, but it should probably make clear that we don't mean in 2025. Because that deliver uncompromised thought paper and DFAR kind of heat and light is very intense, and they don't need it as soon as FDA needs it, but they want to see it's tractable and that this is a viable delivery vehicle for them. We don't have to hit their requirements. I'm just saying for anyone who sees their baby cut into phase 2, we should put some reasonable expectation horizon around what 2 is. So as far as what should be in phase 1, I think we have a lot more confidence on that, and I think to me it's the harmonization of the MVI and the amplification of its adoption. And the first, alpha customer is FDA essentially. People, just as a straw man or initial opening remark, I think it's MVI, harmonization and amplification.
Very good point, and also a very good point on sort of what, for lack of a better term, is the sort of high assurance use case, because I think we do have some idea of what's involved, and that's something that we can do a little extra work fleshing out of what that will look like, even if we're not defining it quite the same precision as the MVI. Les.
So just to be clear on phase 1, I would like to see phase 1 definitely have some recommendation out of, I guess we said the standards group for, oh, you can't hear it. One thing out of, I think we said the standards group was the sharing. So sharing on how this may be and how we may share this, because what will happen, as we know, yes, it's a proof of concept. FDA's going to want whatever. Phase 2 is going to be down here a little bit, and we're still going to have to deliver something, and then the customer's going to want something. So that piece is going to fall between phase 1 and phase 2, I think. So if we have something where we can start down that path and not just push it to phase 2.
Thank you. Further thoughts? So let's talk about the audience of, and we might even want to go group by group here. I don't think it's fair for any of these to assume that, someone who has never touched any of these issues should be able to pick this up and immediately understand it. I think that's going to require a little too much background. But certainly the framing groups, what is an SBOM guide, probably may not want to assume the most technical background. And so do you have thoughts on, think of a hypothetical or an archetypal reader that we can start to have in our heads as we think about each draft? Josh.
So to enumerate potential candidates,
please.
There's I like to design for Bobby Stempley. No, there's the procurement team on how to ask for during purchasing. There's a operator that may use this for inventory and vulnerability management. There's a producer or build person. There's a lawyer or a government affairs person. Those are 2 separate things. And I'm not trying to flood us so that we have to have 10 papers, but I almost wonder if we need 10 intros, right? Like in this room alone, we have government affairs people, software developers, hospital operators, device manufacturers, and again, the nouns and verbs we use are different. So I think they can point to a canonical main body document or documents, but they may need an on-ramp per stakeholder type.
I think it's a great point. We may, from a drafting perspective, that may be a better thing to think about, saying, all right, once we've gotten the feedback, then we'll have that custom interface. But we could do that now if we have the time. We can start planning. Duncan.
Yeah, so I heard 2 groups left off Josh's list, which was the people who actually have to do it. And I'm not even sure we need to aim that as audience, but more importantly, the people who decide, should we be doing this at all? So more the executive or industry or regulator or whatever. And the pros and cons, because it's not necessary in all cases. It is necessary, or it is helpful in some, and sort of the decision makers would be what I would think if what Alan's original listing of sort of the issues was, one was people aren't doing it now, and we sort of collectively think they should be. So what can this set of documents do to change that would be, I think, it should be aimed more at the decision makers. Thank you.
Great. Bruce?
We might consider what we'd have to write if we were going to send it to someplace like CNET or PC World or something like that, and then decide if that was adequate or too much work or something like that, and then back up or change the target a bit. But it seems to me that at least some version of some of the documents ought to be suitable for sending to publications like that.
This is tech journalists being able to make sure that they can easily understand it?
Yeah.
Since the guy's sitting next to a tech journalist. No, and I think building on that a little bit, this gets to the broader awareness and adoption piece, which is even if the documents themselves are more traditional white papers, as we move from draft to something that we think is going to be the phase 1 deliverable, then we're really going to want to spend a lot of time thinking about packaging. Josh talked about facts, and there are other tools. Josh even talked about videos, which, you know, if someone wants to come forward with some production value, I think that's a fun idea. So yeah, we've got the important to say who is going to be consuming it, and then we can also sort of say we can pre-digest certain parts of it. What about the standards group? So the standards group we've talked about, we've got the white paper, which is in draft form.
So I think the how-to guide, which is essentially, okay, so where do I get one of these S-bombs anyway? And how would you maybe hand that to a technical person and have them situated and oriented enough to actually start doing it?
I like that. I think that's great. And that may be combined with the recursion step guide that we just talked about earlier, that I think Art's group is going to be thinking about, which is, hey, an organization is going to do these, check these 6 boxes to be a good actor, or to say we're now SBOM ready. And then one of them is going to be do it with these tech specs. Yeah.
This might be self-serving, but the language you use in somehow suggesting whether it's true or not that this may become a future requirement for government procurement will help me properly motivate my technical teams to actually pay attention and get started on this and take it seriously.
I would certainly never suggest such a thing. I would not, this is true. But it is very easy to start coming up with a very long list of people in the last few weeks alone have suggested that that might be a thing. Certainly NTIA believes that industry can lead this, especially with a decent understanding of the market to drive demand.
I can give you a list in the hallway.
And I think that is a big part of it, which is that if this is coming, it means that we have to get in front of it. And that's, again, as we get into the afternoon, everyone's a little tired, that's your charge, is saying that this is the power of us. We can define what this looks like. And so trying to make sure that we can do that in a way that's effective and still nimble enough to move forward. Art.
Sorry, I was just trying to catch up and make sure my notes matched. The third bullet and the fourth sub-bullet seem to conflict, and I would say I think we are going to define minimum viable product. I have a note here, pending results from the proof of concept.
Proof of concept.
Of course, everything's modifiable by reality of a test, but...
So the proof of concept is not going to define the minimum viable product.
Oh yeah, sorry, I just want to make,
Thank you.
not...
No, that's a very, thank you for catching that.
Right.
And yeah.
And then so we will, yeah, okay, thank you.
The use case group, do you guys have an audience? I think the work they've done, I just saw all the faces react when they sort of show what their research was able to capture. In terms of packaging that, do we have thoughts about audience for that and how we can maximize it and we can sort of do a short version, the near term, and then the sort of stretch goal for how to package that and how to frame that.
Our current thinking is we're nearly done collecting. Just to recap what I said during our 30 minutes, we definitely captured quite a few state of practice of current behavior. What we wanted to shift to between now and June was to capture we'd really like to do this, but we're stuck and there's some obstacles type stuff, which could introduce and amplify which things should be in phase 2. Is the way I'm thinking about it. As far as what we would deliver, though, so as far as harvesting, we would harvest some of those less tangible, less concrete, less successful stories right now for future requirements. But in terms of deliverables between now and then, I think we've got the raw data. We have to package it in more consumable ways for like a CNET type audience, or maybe even some of those stakeholders that we talked about. It's not packaged well. We have the nice unified story, but we don't have it well packaged.
Thank you. No, I think there's some good work to be done there.
Is there consideration to consolidate all the working groups' information into one?
So that is also on the list of how we're going to check down, because I think some of this stuff is going to be freestanding. And so the vision could be something like we have documents that fit quite neatly together, and we want to minimize redundancy, but at the same time, if someone picks up the standards or the quick start guide, can that exist as a freestanding body with pointers to the other side of things? Art.
One specific example, I think I saw 3 working groups give 3 different lists of use cases.
Yep.
And they were mostly the same things, but different words and different levels of outline. So the framing group will take on a task, but we're going to just collect and propose one, or we'll use someone else's, but we should have one and not call them different things in two papers, right? So there's a small example, but we got to get that sorted out. There's some basic like editorial conceptual harmonizing that will make things look more consistent.
And can we please standardize on Oxford commas?
Yes, the framing working group supports the Oxford comma.
As does NTIA.
Okay, good.
Jim.
So the proof of concept group envisages a output to be of 2 forms. One, briefings for the internal NTIA efforts, and the second, public briefings or public discussions or public presentations.
No, I think that's going to be very useful, because there's different timetables there. The other working groups are really going to want your input as soon as it comes out, and the framing probably is going to address also some of the healthcare specific work the HSCC is going to be looking for. And speaking of which, it's a good segue. Afton, we're sorry that you've been waiting in the queue for a little while. I got bumped from the meeting view, so please chime in.
No, it's okay. Jim covered it.
Oh, great. How efficient. Duncan.
So in the interest of trying to meet the June date, I think we'll have to work out, inch pebbles between now and then. And one thing that I would recommend highly be early on the list is come up with a document structure, come up with an outline, and come up with swim lanes, so we don't get into the use case thing that Art just mentioned of the framing thing has one set of use cases when we have another group actually named use cases. So I'm presuming we should refer to theirs, but we can't do that if we don't know what their thing is. So if we sort of come up with some structure and some at least bullet point outline early on, then we can cut down on the wasted work being done in multiple places.
And I think there's so standards group has a very solid draft. The framing group has a pretty good outline that on Friday had a discussion. Now, neither of the co-chairs were there for that discussion, so there's probably some room to revisit that. Also, I want to flag something that Art mentioned that's online, and if we have time, we could probably even visit, which is terminology. They've sort of done the first step of saying, hey, what are some things that we should define? And also speaking to one point that Duncan made earlier, there are also some things that we just want to try to avoid. right? There are terms that, for whatever reason, are going to sort of set off alarms and distract from our efforts. So how do we choose our language carefully? Other things that you think we as a group should try to touch base on moving forward is I want to sort of take you back to this morning when it really was impressive to see convergence for this minimum viable inventory model that I think had some real power of saying we can achieve this. It meets a lot of the use case work. It fits into the standards work. We're trying to build it today.
So to Josh's point earlier on, so my point earlier of, hey, let's focus on phase one, to Josh's point of, hey, let's not forget phase two and beyond. How do you see the phase two and beyond either in these documents? Is there a separate document that's just for us of, hey, we've kicked this can down the road, put it in the parking lot here, or I just want to make sure we have a down the road?
That fantastic question. It's like you know the agenda. So there are a couple of things, which is one, how do we want to address things that are outside the scope of MVI, but are still reflect work that we've done? And I think that's the precise way to capture it, which is each group, and I think in particular we're talking about the framing group and the standards group, can say, hey, listen, we've talked about this stuff and it can be useful, but we're going to be addressing this later. And here's what we know about it. And I think there's even some further polish that can be added on, right? This is known hard problem and will require outside work beyond the scope of this versus this is important and we're going to get to it. So let's take the high assurance use case. We can lay out, hey, here's all the stuff we know about it. Here's how we think we can do it, and we're going to finalize it very soon. Yes?
I would propose, leading off of what Josh said before, that we create a backlog and we define the second sprint as being in a certain time frame.
Say more, which is to say you want to sort of define the fall schedule?
Define the fall, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then we will work on them in priority order, let's say.
Well, the other thing that I want to make sure that is on your radar, because it's something that a bunch of you have come to me about, is the awareness and adoption side of it. I think NTIA has been criticized in the past for saying, we wrote a document, yay, it's on a government website, go use it. We're industry friendly, so industry, go do all your magic thing and prove us right that industry can solve all of this stuff. I think this is something that is going to require some coordination to promote. So what I'd like to do as we get into this is maybe to spend a few minutes talking about what awareness and adoption looks like in general, because I think this is going to require a bunch of ideas and have those ideas turned into a strategy. Right, I think this is something that is going to require a bunch of people have mentioned global coordination, right? This is something that has attention around the world and has lots of points where we can try to both drive interest and inspire demand. And I know a bunch of you have thought about this problem.
During the CVD, you had an adoption awareness working group. They did surveys to capture sentiment, and I thought it was pretty good. And I often refer to the survey results. Sometimes when I'm trying to sell someone on adopting a disclosure program, I'm not sure if you want another group for adoption awareness or not. Secondly, I think a couple of us should do a global world tour like a rock band. Just, just kidding about that part. But there may be some natural watering holes or a calendar of events throughout the year, like FIRST, like this, like that, some of which we've missed already. But there may be some appropriate venues to try to deliberately participate in once we know what we're evangelizing.
No, and I think, so let's try to capture some of what was just said. First is, should we have a working group that is explicitly focused on awareness and adoption? And that can be something that can sort of slowly spin up as various folks are doing that. Or is this something that we should try to coordinate in some other fashion? Thoughts? Duncan?
So I think the answer is yes. The question is when, because I don't think we should start that before we have the thing we're adopting, or we're going to do our usual collision and stuff like that. So I think we need to plan for it. I think we got to be a little careful on cart before the horse.
Except for the fact that on the CVD one, the inputs from the surveys about what do you want, need, or fear from disclosures or whatnot was vital input to the final product.
And I don't disagree, and I don't disagree the calendar is happening regardless of when our output comes out, so we do have to deal with that, so I agree.
I think maybe with all the interviewing that's going on with use cases, that's almost like an alpha version of outreach and communication. And so maybe think about that, because there's contacts, there could be calendars.
And it already has a multi-sector perspective, which is going to be, that's a really good idea.
Yeah, so.
I agree, and is part of our strategy, right? And we're talking to the choir. We want to get outside the choir a bit, right? For the adoption and awareness, these are the people who have already pioneered. We want to find the people who haven't started yet.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Just to broaden the concentric rings of the audience out instead of replicating the process.
And further to JC's point, if we are talking about a sort of version 1 and beyond, the sort of version 2 is going to be work that I see the framing group and the standards group pushing forward into the fall. Whereas the use case group, I think they say, oh, we've done this qualitative research. Folks can enter and exit different working groups. We're not committing you. Even the leadership can change. But I think it's that institutional knowledge is going to be a very useful starting point, as well as the framing that you guys have developed of the supply chain to help identify what are some of the leverage points that we can use. Duncan, unless.
Hitchhiking on Josh's point of we're preaching the choir, we want to get beyond the choir. I think one of our aspects needs to be to get at, I'm going to say the competition. I don't know other way to say it. I don't think it's the goal of anybody in this room that we want to come up with some new standard, some new regulation that we're all writing. We're trying to do all this in a cooperative NTIA, let the market drive fashion of, hey, let's all agree, let's do it, and then prove that we don't need international standards in this area and regulators doing this and all that kind of stuff. So if we want to avoid that, we have to take that into account in our audience, is my point, and in our how we choose to do this.
I do want to say, since there are cameras on me, that NTIA is completely in favor of international standards.
And two, I didn't mean it that way. I meant we should be good enough that we don't need to do that.
No, I think that, and I think the understanding the economics of it so that we can say, hey, we've got these international standards. Let's use them for this is going to be very powerful.
So I say yes too. I'm in favor of some type of work group or something that is a fan base for us. I'm not up on the other industries because it's supposed to be industry-wide. We've been focused as a proof of concept more on the medical. Are there entities in those that can bolster that? For example, you had Seth sitting next to you most of the day, so we do have FDA pushing us on our side. So there is a lot of interest in the medical side, but so is there any in the other industries that can help with that?
I think you're asking me, and he's not a regulator. There's a lot of interest in the defense federal acquisition process. There's interest in the UK code of practice. There's a lot of pioneering work in automotive ISAC, so not government, but the ISAC. And then similarly, the Financial Services Sector Coordinating Council, FISIC or FSSCC, and the Financial Services ISAC has already written a couple papers on this that are several years old now. They did it for a couple of reasons, but there's some mature thinking there that we could maybe borrow from. I mean, they basically sold security hygiene as productivity and operational performance boosts successfully, and we might be able to do something similar. So there's no single answer. Each of those markets are.
I was going for more of a. Is there agencies? And I understand to push these things like the FDA is trying to do on our side.
Well, I think even as we drill down to agencies, this is something that as a different part of government hears about this, they all get very excited. And so we spend some time talking to our colleagues in government. But the real power for adoption comes when there are a couple of big energy or folks who play in manufacturing for the energy sector, like, oh, we know that things are coming down towards us. Let's get in front of the problem. And when we can take those early adopters and leaders and have translators who can then help share the good news has been very useful. Someone who is an expert in energy.
My name is Kelly Cullinane, and I work for New Context Services, and I represent all of our electric utility clients. And we are working on a lot of these types of projects, both at an industry level with our government partners, specifically DOE, and these are things we are starting to talk about. So not nearly as developed as the healthcare industry, but we're kind of in that crawl phase right now.
So are there other sectors that folks want? Sorry, we had a computer freeze, which I guess it's been a while since I've seen a computer freeze before. So are there other sectors that we want to sort of reach? We've got finance, we've got energy, we've got healthcare, and I know, by the way, that the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council is interested in looking past just medical devices to the broader space of healthcare software, which is kind of all of software. And we know that some folks in the software, the general software space are interested in this idea. Art, then Duncan?
Yeah, just a brief comment. I don't have a good sector to recommend. And I think sector-specific approaches is a great way to either both push adoption and do proof of concepts and sort of get things rolling. My suspicion is pretty quickly software becomes software, right? So all the sectors use lib whatever and Linux. So pretty quickly we have to get the traditional compute all software sector to be engaged in this. Just a note, yeah.
And I've done some preliminary outreach in the DevOps and DevSecOps world. It's not something that I come from that world. This message resonates incredibly well in that community. It's probably the most excitement I've seen because they're looking for what can they fit into their incredibly fast build cycle that solves having someone to do the thinking for them. And so they said, oh, well, we can just have the data there and then use some other source of intelligence, and then we can sort of have, increase our pace. JC?
I would sort of echo, but then flip the coin around. There is incredible enthusiasm for DevOps because everyone in DevOps gets to start with a clean sheet of paper. And so they can have all the modern engineering practices and the Git and the version control. And it's the easiest part of all of this to solve. And frankly, solving it is becoming commodity, notwithstanding huge amounts of venture funding going into it. The hard part is for, a medical device or a legacy system or something on-prem. And that's the nut that it seems like we're actually starting to crack. So it's almost like don't take coals to Newcastle. I think those folks are going to get there, even whether they want to or not. GitHub will do it for them. And let's just continue to focus our energy on solving the tough problems, which we actually have a shot at solving.
Great.
So on your industry list, just because I consult with them some on the issue, but any of you in the DC area know the public transportation has been doing some of the same. So Josh mentioned in transportation, the auto industry, but sort of the public transport and train industry has been looking at some of the same issues related particularly, or almost like DoD provenance issues, but similar in that regard. So that'd be one I'd recommend. And two, my career has mostly been in an internet provider for most of my career doing cybersecurity. So I would recommend both, obviously, the whole telecom industry, but more importantly, the security industry itself. I think we are probably the most blatant at being barefoot cobblers' children as anyone is.
We have one security vendor who actually does SBOM in the back.
Yeah, one.
Yes. Jim.
Yeah, if we're trying to identify industries, we might look at OT or,
Sorry, does Siemens make other things other than healthcare devices?
We actually do a few other things, yeah. But ICS isn't it. area
and that may be something to drill down on, is the organizations that have very large product families. I'm looking at GE there as well, that touch on these different sectors as a way of sort of saying, well, how hard is it to leap from this product family to getting, if you guys have done the hard work, how can your colleagues take advantage of the hard work you've done inside an organization? That could be something that'd be very valuable to document, because we can sort of sell that to other companies that have a bunch of different cross verticals.
So another way to advertise or get this out, an example that is helping us on the medical side is the MDS squared form. So in that group, we have included SBOM as part of the questions, and now it has become a lot of customers are asking for the MDS squared form today and wanting the new form around the world. It just isn't just the U.S. So if there are other places or things that you can partner with, that actually bolsters the SBOM as well.
Thank you. JC.
Another area is the whole smart cities domain, because my global search replaces anyone who says smart. Just paste in vulnerable. It's like a vulnerable grid and a vulnerable car self-driving system and all that. And they're procuring, like they want the trash trucks to talk to the trash cans, and I mean there's no assurance around any of this crap. And there's a massive surface. And so I think that it might be a really good opportunity to engage on this sort of, it's industrial, but it's sort of a green field, but it's rah-rah, but no one cares, but everyone's going to get killed. So that would be a good one.
Smart cities is a great example in that it's more of a funding mechanism, and that means there's a few more centralized points to influence and do some outreach for that can trickle down across a whole bunch of different types of companies. Yeah.
All right, I almost want to say this without my mic on first, because this might be jumping ahead to the list of topics we don't want to talk about. So I'm going to watch your face as I say it. During RSA, just before and during RSA, I've been approached with renewed vigor by big insurers because, well, a tiny anecdote you and I have spoken about is the lawsuit between Cadbury's parent company and their insurer Zurich about, is it an act of war because it was not Petya? And there's a lot of people saying, how strong is our insurance policy towards cyber, and have we really thought through our underwriting? And as they're looking for new ways to do this, I have a hunch that a quantifiable, measurable thing like SBOMs and hygiene, or the practice being present or not, could be instructive to their renewed focus. So did you cringe when I said that?
I didn't, and sorry for those of you who don't know me. I've spent about 15 years thinking about security and economics and have some opinions that I won't share about insurance because they're not NTIA opinions. But I think with ongoing efforts like the Marsh Initiative of sort of doing some security tooling work, I think that's there are some active points of outreach that we can go for. I want to put one more thing on the table as we all sort of get slightly punchy, heading towards 4 o'clock, which is something that Art brought up earlier, which is very few people say the future of software is on-prem. And as we think through the cloud side of it, of course, it's very vague, right? This covers everything from pure SaaS to API infrastructure, and then going into all sort of fun, nuanced of, just, hey, I've got an app that talks to a thing. Is there anything that we want to say to it, or at least to put a marker down about how we might talk about it?
I propose it not be phase 1.
That is the joy of having a phase 2 approach, but we've already said we're going to say certain things about phase 2, and it could just be that oh, by the way, down the road we'll talk about the cloud side of things. But it's more of if anyone had a thought, this is now a good time to sort of start getting everyone else's brain working on this topic. Bruce.
So the SBOM has different benefits.
Put your mic a little.
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
The SBOM has different benefits depending on whether you're a supplier or a customer. The supplier, if it's cloud or not, has the same benefits. And so, you know, if you focus on both the customer and the supplier benefits, then cloud at least has all the benefits of the supplier today.
That's a great point. Yeah, everything upstream of the users is going to get that, yeah. All right. Well, so let's recap a little bit. Yes.
Actually, before we recap, when do we get to the sort of retrospective, how can we improve this process part of the conversation?
Experience has shown that any time is a good time to criticize.
Because one of the things that I heard earlier is that we want to bring a whole bunch of new people in to this effort to have them provide their insights, to review documents, that sort of thing. And I think a lot of the groups have actually done a really good job at taking notes and capturing artifacts and that sort of thing. But if I were an internet user, sort of from the outside looking in, finding all of that stuff can actually be a little bit challenging. Is there any way that we could actually improve on that? There's a lot of long-running documents on like Google Docs. There's lots of long-running notes. Could we post links? Could we post links to those on the website? Anything that would actually help people sort of come in and understand where we're at?
I think.
Any thoughts?
No, I think that is a great idea, and certainly something that probably different groups, based on how they've documented, may have different approaches on, hey, if someone's coming in, here's a 70-page Google Doc, and if you read it from the top, you're going to think we're idiots because it took us 40 pages to get our feet under us. Not to say that that isn't a great resource, but saying, what does that introductory process look like? How can we, so for example, this is something where we can look into NTIA creating web presences for these working groups where we can try to capture some of that stuff as we go. I think that's a great idea.
Also, to make sure that it's not lost to history.
Yes, it's true. If only there was some sort of heritage project for software.
So one thing when we say this is always, what can we do better? You also have to include, what do we not want to break that we've done good? I want to commend everyone for having the documents for this meeting on the website as the meeting started. That's a first for us, I believe, and I really think it helps a lot. Next time, maybe if we had them 24 hours before the meeting, it'd be even better. But I do think it was great we did that.
So that gets us to... Duncan has been great at teeing up the next agenda, and it's fantastic. I'd like to put the next two meetings that we're going to have on the calendar now. I think there's incredible value about having all of us in a room together. On the other hand, I know that flying is a pain in the ass, and most of you already do it way too much. Which is why we've been sort of having this rhythm of every other meeting being a virtual meeting. So we'll have slide share and try to have some discussions. Discussions sometimes a little harder, but last time, the one we had in February, I thought was fairly productive. And so in June, we have, I've heard a call for late June, especially if we're going to try to have some deliverables then. And then what I'd like to do is have an in-person meeting during the first 2 weeks of September, probably in Washington, unless someone has a very strong and immediate proposal of where it can be hosted. Do you have space? Yes. Duncan.
On the late June, I guess it's a question. Do you foresee the meeting being after the documents are done, and then sort of what's the purpose of the meeting, or is the meeting to basically be that, hey, we've had the documents out, draft them, let's get them real or whatever? What do you? I'm not sure it should be late June if we want to have the thing out in late June, because I'm worried we'll create them all the day before the meeting and then we won't actually get them out in late June.
Fantastic points, and I appreciate that. And that gives us an option, which is say, well, if we decide to give ourselves we want to have the shareable drafts, this gives us as a community one last chance to sort of share things and kick the tires internally. So that speaks to sort of saying, hey, let's try to get something on the earlier side of June. And then maybe so first is the second week of June. So this would be the third week of June. And that way we could sort of have that. Again, I'm going to sort of encourage a virtual meeting, but if folks think a face-to-face is more effective, I'm happy to sort of hear that feedback. Does anyone want to come back to Washington in 2 months? In June. It's lovely. No. I don't know. Ask the guy from Texas how bad those summers are in D.C. This would be a virtual meeting. In the past, we've done it as sort of 3 hours from sort of 1 to 4. So for folks on the West Coast, it's not quite as painful as a 10 a.m. For folks in Europe, sorry, but you're not watching now because it's already too late. So we will try to work on that. And then the goal there is to have them, we would have the drafts in advance, because I think Duncan has a great point. If we want people to show up and actually give feedback, they need to have had time to read them.
May I suggest virtual meeting the week of June 24th, draft documents due internally to our group, the larger group, 2 weeks in advance. You have 2 weeks to comment and come to the meeting with your strongest set of most important comments on everyone else's work.
I think that works. We'll do our internal work on our calendar, but nothing.
Right, something like that.
Bruce.
Can we, if people submit, comments, can we cover those first by the, authors of the groups? So if you're going to send something out 2 weeks early and people get comments in by, let's say, a week later, then it'd be nice if, you were prepared to address those.
Great. No, that'd be even, yes, that's the advantage of the 2 week note, is it gives us a 1 week barrier to say, hey, if you get them to the group within 7 days, then the group will already start to think it through. So that's even better for feedback. Thank you.
We only have to deal with the meeting with what we can't settle other than face-to-face, and hopefully there'll be none.
Or the heartless, inconsiderate people who didn't bother to do their feedback on time. There are like 3 of them in the entire process, and I'm not going to make eye contact with anyone. And then the second thing is a face-to-face in early September. Can I ask someone that I sent an email out to look up? I threw out a couple of dates. I want to say there was September 10th. And this is mainly just to say it so that we can then circulate it, and if hopefully folks know about the most important conference in your field is happening that week. That's something that we want to try to plan around, if possible. They canceled DEF CON. Sorry.
You suggested September 2nd or 9th.
Thank you.
In your message.
September 2nd or 9th. I believe both of those are...
September 2nd is Labor Day.
Oh, sorry, the week of September 2nd.
Week of, not
sorry,
those
yes.
dates, sorry.
And I think, hang on a second, I will put something out. Does anyone know of major events? Obviously, there are going to be conferences all the time. Does anyone know of major events that are going to be happening either of those 2 weeks?
The second week is my vacation, so you can avoid me.
Okay. Celebrate. Who doesn't want to celebrate? Washington, D.C., known as the City of Romance. It's the week of the 2nd is good. That is Labor Day week. It's true. All right, we will do some planning. This was sort of your chance to give us that kind of feedback. And I think that hits most of what we wanted to cover at this meeting. And I just want to sort of try to do a little recap here because I'm kind of blown away by all the work that's happened here. If you go back even to November and think of where we were just now, it is very easy to look and say, oh, this is what an SBOM is. And it seems like it's pretty easy to imagine a world where we can do this without too much trouble. There are always going to be edge cases. There are always going to be complexities. As Diane said this morning, if this were easy, it would have been done by now. But you guys have tackled some pretty hard problems. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take this framing around the minimum viable inventory identity, minimum viable identity, the MVI. First, we're going to define what MVI means. And then we're going to say, this is what it is. We're going to sketch it out in terms of the what, the high-level sort of overview of it, the why, how it can change, how we think about software, risk, and quality all across the ecosystem, and then the how, documenting, here are all the tools that we have, and also, here's how you can do it today. This is kind of the core. This is kind of an exciting point to be at this process because we're now actually can sort of say this is what not the end looks like, but what the path to progress is really going to look like. And so unless there are any final comments, I want to thank Megan, who has been doing all the work to capture what we have. We're going to be posting these notes online. This video will be available online in a few days. And the only thing left for me to do is to give you all my heartfelt thanks. This only works because you are passionate and hardworking and are willing to find ways to bridge your differences and figure out how to make this work. So I want to thank you all. And for those of you who've been to these meetings before, there's a bar a few blocks away where we'll do our debrief. So thank you all and have a great day. Thanks for watching.